Then you must hear this history. I'm 100% sure that after listening to this story, your sleep will be complete. Why? Because you will finally realize that your freedom isn't a coincidence. It's a 250-year-old insurance policy that is being tested right now. In 1791, the Founding Fathers created what they called a parchment barrier, the Bill of Rights. They knew that power, like fire, is a dangerous servant and a fearful master. For centuries, these 462 words have stood as a wall between you and absolute state control. But today, in the face of 2026, that wall is cracking. From the surveillance in your pocket to the algorithms predicting your next thought, the battlefield has moved from the streets to your soul. We are currently in a sovereign siege. As we approach America's 250th anniversary, new executive powers and AI task forces are challenging the very idea of state sovereignty and personal privacy. By April 2026, the laws protecting your digital castle will face a final sunset. The question isn't just about what happened in the past, it's about whether these 18th century rights can survive a 21st century machine that never sleeps. History is a mirror, and right now it's reflecting a choice that belongs to you. Liberty is never permanently won, it is only borrowed, and the bill is coming due. If you want to understand the full mystery of this history and see how it ends, click the link I've pinned in the comment box below to watch the complete video. Thank you for watching, and stay vigilant. Bloody revolution, standing on the edge of total bankruptcy. The United States has no credit, no navy, and 13 states that hate each other's guts. While the history books focus on the Constitution, the real battle for America's soul wasn't fought with muskets, it was fought with a ledger. This is the story of how a simple tax on imported glass and nails became the spark that led to assassination threats, secret midnight deals, and eventually the deadliest war in American history. This is the Great American Tariff War. In 1789, the United States was destitute. The Revolutionary War had left the country drowning in $54 million of debt. European powers were circling like vultures, waiting for the American experiment to collapse so they could reclaim their colonies. Enter Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury, a man with a vision for a powerful industrial America, and James Madison, the father of the Constitution, who wanted an America of independent farmers. The first act. On July 4, 1789, President George Washington signed the Tariff Act of 1789. On the surface, it was simple, a 5% tax on most imported goods. But beneath the surface, a war was brewing. Hamilton realized that if the U.S. only farmed and sold raw materials, like tobacco and cotton, to Europe, while buying all its finished goods, like clothes and tools, back from England, it would never truly be free. He wanted protective tariffs, high taxes on foreign goods, to force Americans to buy American-made products. The Great Divide. The North loved it. Factories were popping up in Pennsylvania and Massachusetts. A high tariff meant they could charge more and grow rich. The South hated it. They had no factories. To them, a tariff was a northern tax. It forced Southern plantation owners to pay more for basic supplies, while their primary customers, the British, threatened to stop buying Southern cotton in retaliation. The stakes. This wasn't just about money, it was about identity. The North saw a future of iron, steam, and cities. The South saw a future of soil, slavery, and tradition. By the time Washington left office, the tariff had saved the U.S. Treasury from collapse, but it had also drawn a line in the sand. The unity of the Revolution was over. The era of the internal Cold War had begun. For a moment, the War of 1812 changed everything. As British warships blockaded American ports, the flow of European goods, fine clothes, iron tools, and luxury glass, simply stopped. Out of sheer necessity, Americans began building their own factories. By 1815, 100,000 factory workers were churning out $40 million worth of goods. For the first time, America was making its own gear. But when the war ended, the British struck back, not with cannons, but with economic warfare. The Great British Dumping. British manufacturers had warehouses overflowing with 4 years' worth of unsold goods. Their strategy was cold and calculated. Dump these products onto American shores at prices so low that American factories couldn't possibly compete. One British minister even boasted in Parliament that it was worth the loss to stifle in the cradle those rising manufacturers in the United States. New England mills began to shudder. The American economy was on the verge of being recolonized by British merchants. The Tariff of 1816, the Shield. In a rare moment of national unity, Congress passed the Tariff of 1816. It wasn't just a tax for revenue, it was the first truly protective tariff in U.S. history. It slapped a 25% duty on cotton and wool imports and similar taxes on iron and leather. The goal? To give infant industries room to breathe. Even Southern leaders like John Calhoun, who would later become the tariff's greatest enemy, supported it at first. They believed that for America to be truly independent, it needed to be able to clothe and arm itself without begging London for supplies. The American System, Henry Clay's master plan. By 1824, a charismatic Kentuckian named Henry Clay took the stage. He proposed a massive, visionary plan called the American System. He didn't just want a tariff, he wanted a self-sustaining American empire. His plan had 3 pillars: high tariffs to protect northern factories, a national bank to keep the currency stable, and internal improvements, using the tariff money to build roads and canals, like the Erie Canal, to connect the West and North. Clay's dream was a giant circle. The West would send food to the North would send manufactured goods to the West, and everyone would be rich, except for the South. As the Tariff of 1824 pushed rates even higher, the era of good feelings evaporated. The South realized they were being left out of Clay's great circle. They weren't getting the roads or the factories, they were just paying higher prices for their clothes and tools to subsidize northern wealth. The stage was now set for the most explosive political battle in American history, the moment the South decided that a federal tax was a theft they would no longer tolerate. The atmosphere in Washington was toxic. The supporters of Andrew Jackson wanted to humiliate the sitting president, John Quincy Adams, before the upcoming election. They came up with a scheme they thought was genius: the political poison pill. Jackson's allies in Congress drafted a new tariff bill designed to be so extreme, so abominable, that even the manufacturing North would have to vote against it. They loaded it with high taxes on raw materials like hemp, flax, and molasses. Their logic was simple. The North would reject the bill because it made their raw materials too expensive, Adams would be blamed for the failure to protect industry, and Jackson would sweep the election. But the plan backfired. To the Southerners' horror, the Northern congressmen held their noses and voted yes. They decided that some protection was better than none. On May 19, 1828, the Tariff of Abominations became law, slapping duties of nearly 50% on imported goods. The South's fury. The South felt like they had been stabbed in the back. In Charleston, flags were flown at half-mast. They weren't just paying more for clothes and tools. They were watching their wealth being forcibly transferred to northern factory owners. South Carolina, the heart of the resistance, argued that this wasn't just a tax, it was an unconstitutional use of federal power. If the government could use taxes to favor one region over another, what else could they do? The underlying fear was clear. If the North could control the South's economy through tariffs, they could eventually control the South's peculiar institution, slavery. The vice president's secret. The most shocking part of this drama was the man leading the rebellion, John C. Calhoun, the sitting Vice President of the United States. Because he was still in office, he couldn't openly attack his own government. Instead, he became a ghostwriter. He anonymously penned a document titled the South Carolina Exposition and Protest. In this 35,000-word manifesto, Calhoun introduced a terrifying new legal theory, nullification. He argued that the United States was a compact of sovereign states. Therefore, if a state decided a federal law was unconstitutional, it had the right to declare that law null and void within its borders. The explosion. When Andrew Jackson won the election of 1828, the South expected him to kill the tariff immediately. After all, he was a Southerner and a slaveholder. But Jackson was first and foremost a Union man. When South Carolina officially moved to nullify the tariff in 1832 and threatened to secede, quit the U.S., if they were forced to pay, Jackson didn't negotiate. He grew furious. He called nullification treason and prepared for war. He famously told a congressman that if one drop of blood was shed there in opposition to the laws of the United States, I will hang the first man of them I can get my hands on to the first tree I can find. The United States was no longer just arguing over taxes. It was now staring down the barrel of a civil war, 30 years before the first shots at Fort Sumter. By late 1832, the United States was a powder keg. South Carolina had officially passed the Ordinance of Nullification, declaring federal tariffs null, void, and no law. They weren't just protesting, they were preparing for war. Governor Robert Hayne began raising a volunteer army of 25,000 men, and in Charleston, the Nullies were sewing blue cockades onto their hats, a symbol of defiance against the federal government. Jackson's ultimatum. President Andrew Jackson, the battle-hardened Old Hickory, viewed this as a personal insult and a national threat. While he was a Southerner who generally favored lower taxes, he believed the Union was sacred. In December 1832, he issued the Nullification Proclamation. It was a masterpiece of political rhetoric, telling the people of South Carolina that disunion by armed force is treason. Behind the scenes, he moved the U.S. Navy into Charleston Harbor and reinforced federal forts. He didn't just want the money, he wanted to prove that the president had the power to make a state obey. The Force Bill and the Secret Deal. To give his threats teeth, Jackson asked Congress for the Force Bill. This was a terrifying piece of legislation. It authorized the president to use the U.S. Army and Navy to collect duties by force, if necessary. It was the sword. But Jackson knew that if he actually invaded South Carolina, the rest of the South might rise up in sympathy, sparking a total civil war in 1833. He needed an olive branch. That branch came from an unlikely source, his bitter rivals, Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun. Calhoun had resigned as vice president, becoming the first in history to do so, to take a Senate seat where he could fight Jackson face to face. Clay, the great compromiser, didn't like Calhoun, but he feared Jackson's growing power even more. In secret, the two enemies struck a deal to save the country and Calhoun's neck. The Compromise Tariff of 1833. On March 2, 1833, Jackson signed two bills at the same time. The Force Bill, the sword that asserted federal authority. The Compromise Tariff, the olive branch that promised to gradually reduce all tariff rates over the next 10 years until they hit a flat 20% by 1842. A fragile peace. South Carolina, realizing no other southern state was willing to join their rebellion yet, took the deal. They repealed their nullification of the tariff, but in a final act of pure defiance, they voted to nullify the Force Bill. It was a hollow gesture, but it sent a clear message. The crisis was solved, but the fundamental question remained: who is truly sovereign, the states or the federal government? The North had its factories protected for a few more years. The South had its lower taxes promised. But the Great American Tariff War had successfully taught the South one dangerous lesson. The only way to truly protect their interests was the threat of leaving the Union. That had saved the Union a decade earlier was falling apart. According to the deal made by Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, tariff rates were supposed to drop to a flat 20% by June 30th, 1842. For the South, this was their promised land of free trade. For Northern industrialists, it was a death sentence. The panic and the power vacuum. The U.S. was in the middle of a brutal economic depression known as the Panic of 1837. Banks were failing, and the federal government was literally running out of money. In the midst of this chaos, President William Henry Harrison died just 31 days into his term, leaving John Tyler, a man without a party, in the White House. The Whig Party, led by Henry Clay, saw an opportunity. They argued that the only way to save the Treasury and protect American jobs was to break the 1833 promise and jack the taxes back up. The birth of the Black Tariff. In August 1842, Congress passed the Tariff of 1842. Southerners immediately branded it the Black Tariff, not because of race, but because they viewed it as a black-hearted betrayal of the Compromise of 1833. This law wasn't just a minor adjustment, it was a total reversal. Average rates were pushed back up to nearly 40%. It specifically targeted iron, a move that delighted Pennsylvania but infuriated the South, as it made the tools needed for farming and the budding railroads incredibly expensive. Import trade crashed. In 1843, imports into the U.S. were cut nearly in half. The political earthquake of 1844. The Black Tariff became the central issue of the 1844 presidential election. The Whigs ran Henry Clay, the father of protectionism. The Democrats ran James K. Polk, a dark horse candidate from Tennessee. Polk played a brilliant, if slightly deceptive, game. In the North, he campaigned as a moderate who would protect necessary industries. In the South, he campaigned as a free trader who would kill the Black Tariff. Polk won by a razor-thin margin. The message from the American people was clear. The high tariff era had to end. The Walker Tariff, the South's revenge. In 1846, Polk's Secretary of the Treasury, Robert J. Walker, introduced a bill that would change American trade for the next 15 years. The Walker Tariff of 1846 didn't just lower rates, it revolutionized how they were calculated. Standardization. Instead of thousands of complex rules, it created a simple schedule system, Schedule A, B, C, etc. Dramatic cuts. It slashed the black tariff rates from 40% down to roughly 25%. The revenue-only principle. Walker argued that the government should only tax enough to pay its bills, not to protect specific northern businesses. The global connection. Luck was on Polk's side. Just as the U.S. lowered its tariffs, Great Britain repealed its famous corn laws, opening up the British market to American grain and cotton. This created a golden age of trade. For the next decade, the tariff debate finally went quiet. But this peace was an illusion. Underneath the surface, the North was growing faster than ever, and the South was becoming more dependent on a single crop. The economic Cold War was over for now, but the ingredients for the real war were being stirred. For a decade, the Walker Tariff had brought a strange, quiet prosperity. Cotton was king, northern factories were growing, and the tariff debate seemed like a ghost of the past. But in late 1857, the ghost returned with a vengeance. The Great Crash. In August 1857, the failure of the Ohio Life Insurance and Trust Company sparked a financial wildfire. Banks collapsed, railroads went bankrupt, and thousands of workers in northern cities were suddenly out of a job. While the North spiraled into a depression, the South remained relatively unscathed. Europe still needed cotton, and Southern leaders began to brag that their slave economy was superior to the unstable industrial capitalism of the North. This fueled a dangerous arrogance in the South and a desperate anger in the North. The protectionist rebirth. Northern industrialists and laborers weren't just angry, they were looking for a scapegoat. They found it in the Tariff of 1857, a low-tax law passed months before the crash. Economic thinkers like Henry C. Carey began telling the public that the crash wasn't caused by bad banking, but by free trade. He argued that by lowering taxes on foreign goods, the government had allowed the British to drain America of its gold and destroy its jobs. This message was a gift to a brand new political organization, the Republican Party. The Morrill Tariff, the final spark. In 1860, a congressman from Vermont named Justin Morrill introduced a bill that would change American history. The Morrill Tariff wasn't just a tax hike, it was a total return to the high protectionist walls of Alexander Hamilton and Henry Clay. The bill passed the House, but stalled in the Senate because Southern Democrats still held the power there. However, the Republicans used the Morrill Tariff as their economic hook in the 1860 election. To win over key swing states like Pennsylvania and New Jersey, Abraham Lincoln campaigned on a platform that combined the moral cause of free soil, ending the spread of slavery, with the economic cause of high tariffs. The secession trigger. When Lincoln won the election in November 1860, the South saw the writing on the wall. They didn't just fear that Lincoln would end slavery, they feared that he would use the Morrill Tariff to drain the South of its wealth to pay for Northern railroads and factories. As Southern states began to secede in early 1861, their senators and representatives walked out of Congress. This was a massive strategic mistake. By leaving their seats, the Southerners removed the only obstacle to the high tariff. On March 2, 1861, just 2 days before Lincoln's inauguration, outgoing President James Buchanan signed the Morrill Tariff into law. The point of no return. The United States now had a high tariff law on the books and a president committed to enforcing it. The South, now calling itself the Confederate States of America, wrote a clause into their own Constitution banning protective tariffs forever. The economic divorce was complete. The North was now a fortress of protection, and the South was a free trade republic. The tension had moved beyond the halls of Congress. The next time these two sides met to discuss adjustments, they wouldn't be using pens and ledgers, they would be using bayonets and cannons.
First shells hit Fort Sumter. The economic reality of the conflict was already set. The North had the Morrill Tariff, a high protective barrier. The South had a constitution that banned protective tariffs entirely, betting everything on King Cotton and the hope that Europe would fight to keep trade lines open. The North, the great money machine. War is expensive. The Union needed to raise $3 billion, an unthinkable sum in the 1860s. While history focuses on Lincoln's greenbacks, paper money, and the first-ever income tax, it was the tariff that served as the backbone of the Union Treasury. Throughout the war, Congress didn't just keep the Morrill Tariff, they jacked it up. By 1865, the average rate on imported goods hit a staggering 47%. The revenue. These taxes brought in $345 million, nearly half of all federal tax revenue during the war. The paradise for manufacturers. With foreign competition taxed out of the market, Northern factories exploded with growth. They weren't just making uniforms and rifles for the Army, they were making massive profits. For the first time, American industry was completely shielded from the rest of the world. The South, the free trade trap. The Confederacy's plan was the opposite, free trade. They believed that because British and French factories needed Southern cotton, those nations would break the Union blockade to get it. But the plan failed spectacularly. The blockade. The Union Navy sat outside southern ports. Even if the Confederacy had a 0% tariff, it didn't matter if no ships could get in or out. No revenue. Because the South refused to tax imports to stay true to their anti-tariff ideology, their government was broke. They tried to print money to pay for the war, leading to hyperinflation. By the end of the war, a loaf of bread in Richmond cost $300 in Confederate money. The British pivot. Britain didn't break the blockade. They simply started buying their cotton from India and Egypt. The hidden victory. By the time the war ended in 1865, the tariff had done more than just pay for bullets. It had permanently re-engineered the American economy. The South was economically leveled, its infrastructure destroyed, and its currency worthless. The North emerged as an industrial superpower, protected by a massive tax wall that foreign competitors couldn't climb. The Great Adjustment of the war years meant that the United States was no longer a collection of farming states. It was now an industrial empire. The high tariff regime, born in the chaos of 1861, would stay in place for the next 50 years, fueling what we now call the Gilded Age. After the Civil War, the temporary high tariffs of the 1860s didn't go away. Instead, they became a permanent wall that birthed a new kind of American royalty, the robber barons. The trust machine. Men like Andrew Carnegie, Steel, and the titans of the textile industry realized that the high tariff was a gift from God, or more accurately, from Congress. By keeping foreign competitors out, the government essentially gave these industrialists a license to monopoly. Because there was no threat of cheap British steel or German chemicals, these trusts could fix prices as high as they wanted. The tariff acted as a hidden subsidy, redistributing nearly 9% of the entire U.S. GDP from the pockets of ordinary consumers directly into the bank accounts of the industrial elite. By the 1880s, the U.S. Treasury was so flooded with tariff money that it actually had a massive budget surplus. The government was literally taking in more money than it knew how to spend. The Napoleon of Protection. In 1890, a rising star in the Republican Party named William McKinley, the future president, decided the wall wasn't high enough. He passed the McKinley Tariff, pushing rates to an unprecedented 49.5%. McKinley argued that this was for the American worker, protecting their high wages from pauper labor in Europe. But the reality on the ground was different. Prices for basic necessities, tin cups, wool coats, farm tools, skyrocketed overnight. To make matters worse, foreign nations retaliated by slapping their own tariffs on American crops, crushing the farmers of the West and South. The rise of the populists. The backlash was explosive. In the Great Plains and the South, farmers were drowning in debt. They saw the billion-dollar Congress spending their tax money on subsidies for railroads while they lost their land. This anger gave birth to the Populist Party, the People's Party. Their message was simple. The tariff was a theft committed by the East Coast elites against the producing classes. In their 1892 Omaha platform, they demanded a graduated income tax to replace the tariff and make the rich pay their fair share. Free silver to create inflation and help them pay off their debts. Direct election of senators to stop the robber barons from literally buying their way into the government. The Great Debate of 1896. The struggle reached a fever pitch in the 1896 election. It was William McKinley, the Napoleon of Protection, versus William James Bryan, the boy orator of the populists. McKinley won, and for a few more years, the high tariff wall stood firm. But the seeds of a revolution had been sown. The American public was starting to realize that you couldn't have a true democracy if the government's tax system was designed to make a few men kings while everyone else struggled to buy a pair of boots. Public had reached its breaking point.
The high tariff system of the Gilded Age had created a country of extremes, ultra-wealthy oil and steel magnates on one side and struggling city workers and farmers on the other. The Great Swap, 1913. Newly elected President Woodrow Wilson believed that high tariffs were the mother of all trusts. To kill the monopolies, he had to kill the tariff. But there was a problem. The government needed money to run. How do you replace the billions of dollars generated by import taxes? The answer was the 16th Amendment. On October 3, 1913, Wilson signed the Underwood-Simmons Act. It was the most significant adjustment in history. The cut. It slashed tariff rates from 40% down to 26%, the lowest they had been since before the Civil War. The replacement. It introduced the first permanent federal income tax. For the first time in American history, the government's bank account shifted. It stopped taxing things coming into the country and started taxing the money people made inside the country. This was supposed to be the end of the tariff wars. The Return of the Wall, 1920s. The peace didn't last. After World War I, a wave of isolationism swept the U.S. Americans were tired of Europe's problems and wanted to close the doors. The Republican presidents of the 1920s, Harding and Coolidge, brought back the old protective philosophy with the Fordney-McCumber Tariff of 1922. They introduced two economic weapons: the scientific tariff, a rule that linked taxes to foreign wages. If an Italian worker was paid less than an American, the tariff was raised to even the playing field. The American selling price, a sneaky rule that calculated the tax based on the American price of a product, not what it actually cost to import. For a few years, the Roaring Twenties made it look like it was working, but underneath the surface, a global disaster was brewing. The Smoot-Hawley disaster, 1930. In 1929, the stock market crashed. As the Great Depression took hold, Congress panicked. Instead of opening trade to jumpstart the economy, they did the exact opposite. Senators Reed Smoot and Willis Hawley drafted a bill that would become a cautionary tale for every economist in history, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. It raised taxes on over 20,000 imported goods. Over 1,000 economists signed a petition begging President Herbert Hoover to veto it, warning that it would spark a global trade war. Hoover ignored them. He signed it. The global backfire. The world didn't just sit back and watch. Within months, 25 countries retaliated. Canada raised taxes on American eggs and newspapers. France and Britain shut their doors to American cars. The result? Global trade didn't just slow down, it evaporated. Between 1929 and 1933, world trade plummeted by 66%. The tariff, which was meant to protect the American farmer, ended up destroying the foreign markets where they sold their crops. The Great Depression wasn't just a domestic crash anymore. It was a global dark age, fueled by a trade war that no one could win. By 1933, the United States was a fortress in a world of ruins. The Smoot-Hawley tariff had succeeded in protecting the country so well that trade had practically ceased to exist. The Secretary of Peace, Cordell Hull. President Franklin Roosevelt's Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, had a radical theory. If goods cannot cross borders, armies will. He believed that high tariffs weren't just bad economics, they were the cause of wars. In 1934, Hull and FDR pushed through the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act, RTAA. This was a massive constitutional pivot. Congress, for the first time, handed over its power to set tariffs to the president. This allowed the president to negotiate deals with other countries. If you lower your tax on our wheat, we'll lower our tax on your wine. Between 1934 and 1945, American tariffs plummeted from an average of 46% to 12%. The wall was finally coming down. The Pax Americana, 1947 to 1995. After World War II, the U.S. didn't just join the global market, it built it. At the Bretton Woods Conference and later the GATT, the United States convinced the world to adopt a low-tariff system. The logic was simple. The U.S. would keep its markets open to help Europe and Japan rebuild. In return, those countries would become stable, democratic allies against the Soviet Union. For 50 years, the tariff war was considered a relic of the past. By the time the World Trade Organization was formed in 1995, the average U.S. tariff was a mere 1 to 3%. The Return of the Ghost, 2018 to 2025. However, history is a circle. By the 21st century, the same arguments used by Alexander Hamilton and William McKinley began to echo again. As American manufacturing jobs moved overseas and the trade deficit with China exploded, the America First movement brought the tariff back from the dead. In 2018, the U.S. slapped massive tariffs on steel, aluminum, and billions of dollars of Chinese goods. Suddenly, the 1800s were back. Once again, the North, now the Rust Belt, demanded protection for its factories. Once again, foreign nations retaliated by taxing American farm exports. Once again, the simple tax on goods became the center of a battle for America's national identity. Conclusion: the ledger of blood and gold. From the first ledger of Alexander Hamilton in 1789 to the high-stakes trade wars of 2025, the American tariff has never been just a tax. It was the fuel for the Industrial Revolution, the trigger for the nullification crisis, the bank account of the Union Army, and the shield of the robber barons. The history of American tariff adjustments is the history of America itself, a constant, often violent struggle to decide whether the nation should be a self-sufficient fortress or a global leader. The walls may go up and they may come down, but the great American tariff war is a story that never truly ends.
The public had reached its breaking point. The high tariff system of the Gilded Age had created a country of extremes: ultra-wealthy oil and steel magnates on one side and struggling city workers and farmers on the other. The Great Swap, 1913. Newly elected President Woodrow Wilson believed that high tariffs were the mother of all trusts. To kill the monopolies, he had to kill the tariff. But there was a problem. The government needed money to run. How do you replace the billions of dollars generated by import taxes? The answer was the 16th Amendment. On October 3, 1913, Wilson signed the Underwood-Simmons Act. It was the most significant adjustment in history. The cut: it slashed tariff rates from 40% down to 26%, the lowest they had been since before the Civil War. The replacement: it introduced the first permanent federal income tax. For the first time in American history, the government's bank account shifted. It stopped taxing things coming into the country and started taxing the money people made inside the country. This was supposed to be the end of the tariff wars. The return of the wall, 1920s. The peace didn't last. After World War I, a wave of isolationism swept the U.S. Americans were tired of Europe's problems and wanted to close the doors. The Republican presidents of the 1920s, Harding and Coolidge, brought back the old protective philosophy with the Fordney-McCumber Tariff of 1922. They introduced two economic weapons:
the scientific tariff, a rule that linked taxes to foreign wages. If an Italian worker was paid less than an American, the tariff was raised to even the playing field. And the American selling price, a sneaky rule that calculated the tax based on the American price of a product, not what it actually cost to import. The Smoot-Hawley disaster, 1930. In 1929, the stock market crashed. As the Great Depression took hold, Congress panicked. Instead of opening trade to jumpstart the economy, they did the exact opposite. Senators Reed Smoot and Willis Hawley drafted a bill that would become a cautionary tale for every economist in history, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. It raised taxes over 20,000 imported goods. Over 1,000 economists signed a petition begging President Herbert Hoover to veto it, warning that it would spark a global trade war. Hoover ignored them. He signed it. The global backfire. The world didn't just sit back and watch. Within months, 25 countries retaliated with beggar-thy-neighbor policies. Canada, the U.S.'s biggest trade partner, immediately jacked up tariffs on 16 categories of U.S. goods, including coal, fruit, and vegetables. Europe retaliated by targeting American-made cars. U.S. automobile exports plummeted by an additional 33% after the act passed. The result? Global trade didn't just slow down, it evaporated. Between 1929 and 1934, world trade plummeted by 66%. The tariff, which was meant to protect the American farmer, ended up destroying the foreign markets where they sold their crops. The Great Depression wasn't just a domestic crash anymore. It was a global dark age. By 1933, the Smoot-Hawley experiment had failed so catastrophically that the U.S. was ready for a complete 180-degree turn. The man who led this charge was Secretary of State Cordell Hull, who believed that unhampered trade dovetailed with peace, high tariffs and trade barriers with war. The Great Pivot, 1934 to 1947. In 1934, Congress passed the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act, RTAA. This was a constitutional earthquake. For nearly 150 years, Congress had fought over every penny of a tariff. Now they handed that power to the president. The deal: the president could now negotiate bilateral deals to cut tariffs by up to 50% in exchange for other countries doing the same. The result? U.S. tariffs plummeted from an average of 46% in 1934 to just 12% by 1945. The Fortress America mindset was dead. The Pax Americana and the WTO, 1947 to 1995. After World War II, the U.S. became the world's economic policeman. It led the creation of the GATT in 1947. The goal was simple: prevent another Great Depression by ensuring trade flowed freely. Through 8 massive negotiation rounds, like the Kennedy Round and the Uruguay Round, global tariffs were systematically dismantled. By the time the World Trade Organization, WTO, was born in 1995, the average U.S. tariff on industrial goods had shrunk to a mere 2 to 3%. For half a century, Americans forgot that tariffs were once the most controversial topic in their history. They became the invisible tax. The Return of the Shield, 2018 to 2025. But history is a circle, not a line. In 2018, the consensus shattered. Arguing that globalism had hollowed out the American heartland and trade wars are good and easy to win, the U.S. launched the most aggressive tariff campaign since the 1930s. The China front. The U.S. slapped 25% tariffs on $250 billion of Chinese imports, targeting everything from semiconductors to furniture. the national security gambit. Using a rare law, Section 232, the government placed tariffs on steel and aluminum from even its closest allies, arguing that a weak domestic steel industry was a threat to national defense. By 2024 and 2025, the debate has reached a fever pitch. In the current political landscape, tariffs are no longer just about economics. They are a weapon for decoupling from rivals. The U.S. is now seeing some of its highest effective tariff revenues in decades, with collections doubling between 2015 and 2024. The final ledger, 1789 versus 2025. The story ends where it began. In 1789, Alexander Hamilton used tariffs to build a nation from scratch. In 2025, modern leaders are using them to try and rebuild a nation they felt was lost to globalism. The Great American Tariff War is not a closed chapter in a history book. It is a living, breathing conflict. As we look at the prices on our shelves and the factories in our towns, we are seeing the latest entries in a 230-year-old ledger. A ledger written in both gold and blood.
Lived under the Pax Americana, a period where the U.S. championed low tariffs as the key to world peace. But by the early 21st century, the ghost of Alexander Hamilton returned. Many Americans felt that while global trade made products cheaper, it had hollowed out the industrial heartland. The China shock and the pivot. The turning point began in the early 2000s, but it exploded in 2018. The U.S. government realized that the low tariff regime had allowed rivals like China to dominate key industries, steel, solar panels, and semiconductors. In a move that mirrored the high protectionist 1890s, the U.S. launched a series of Section 301 and Section 232 tariffs. These weren't just taxes, they were national security weapons. The goal was to force companies to move their factories back to U.S. soil. The Liberation Day tariffs of 2025. As we stand in 2025, the Great Adjustment has reached its most extreme point in a century. Following the 2024 election, the U.S. implemented what some call the Liberation Day tariffs. The 10% blanket. A 10% tax was placed on every single item coming into the country, regardless of where it came from. The reciprocal hammer. Taking a page from the McKinley era, the U.S. began charging other countries exactly what they charge us. If a country puts a 25% tax on American cars, the U.S. now hits them with a 25% tax on their exports. The tech siege. Tariffs on critical tech from Taiwan and South Korea reached as high as 32%, aimed at protecting the infant American semiconductor industry. The modern fallout. A new kind of war. The impact has been immediate and divisive, much like the Tariff of Abominations in 1828. Inflation versus investment. Prices for electronics and cars have surged, straining family budgets. However, billions of dollars are flowing into new American factories in states like Ohio and Arizona. The retaliation cycle. Just as in 1930, trading partners have struck back. Canada and the EU have placed tit-for-tat taxes on American farm goods, leaving farmers in the Midwest feeling like the sacrificial lambs of this new trade war. The revenue shift. For the first time since 1913, there is serious talk in Washington about whether tariff revenue could once again replace or significantly reduce the federal income tax. The ledger's final word. The 230-year-old battle over the American tariff has come full circle. We have moved from Hamilton's infant industries through the blood of the Civil War, past the disaster of Smoot-Hawley, into the age of globalism, and back again to the fortress.
History shows us that the tariff is never just a number on a spreadsheet. It is a statement of who a country wants to be. Is America a global merchant or a self-contained island? As of 2025, the answer is clear. The wall is back up, and the world is holding its breath to see if it brings a new industrial renaissance or a global economic winter. By the 1880s, the United States was facing a problem that sounds impossible today. The government had too much money. Because the Civil War-era tariffs were never lowered, the U.S. Treasury was overflowing with a massive cash surplus. This problem triggered one of the most corrupt eras in American political history: the pension bribe. The Republican Party, which championed high tariffs, knew that if the Treasury stayed too full, the public would demand a tax cut. To prevent this, they had to find ways to spend the money fast. They hit upon a brilliant political strategy, the Dependent Pension Act. They began giving massive monthly checks to hundreds of thousands of Civil War veterans. While this seemed noble, it was a calculated move. It ensured that a massive voting bloc, the veterans, would always vote for high tariffs, because if the tariffs were cut, their pension checks might disappear. The tariff was no longer about protecting industry. It was about buying votes. The rise of the sugar trust. This era saw the birth of the lobbyist. Nowhere was this more evident than in the sugar tariff. At the time, sugar was a luxury and a necessity. The Sugar Trust, a monopoly that controlled 98% of U.S. sugar production, literally sat in the galleries of Congress, dictating the tax rates to senators. By placing a massive tariff on foreign sugar, Congress allowed the trust to overcharge every single American family for a basic kitchen staple. It was a kitchen table tax that transferred millions of dollars from the pockets of housewives into the pockets of a few sugar kings in New York. The 1888 Murchison Letter Scandal. The tariff became so central to American life that it even led to international election interference. In the 1888 election, a fake letter was leaked suggesting that the British government wanted the Democrat, Cleveland Grover, to win because he favored lower tariffs. The pro-British label was political poison. The American public, still harboring Revolutionary-era resentment, turned against Cleveland. Benjamin Harrison won the presidency on a platform of patriotic protectionism. The message was clear. If you wanted to be a true American, you had to support high taxes on imports. The Billion-Dollar Congress. Under Harrison, the government became the first in history to spend $1 billion in a single session. They spent the tariff surplus on massive naval expansion and pork barrel projects, local projects meant to win favor. But the gold had a dark side. In the South and the West, farmers were seeing the prices of their crops drop while the price of their equipment, protected by the tariff, stayed high. They were being squeezed by a system they couldn't control. The breaking point. The chapter of the 1880s teaches us a vital lesson. When a tax becomes a source of easy money for a government, it stops being an economic policy and starts being a tool for power. The Gilded Age was built on these tariffs, but it created a pressure cooker of class resentment that would eventually lead to the most radical political movement in U.S. history, the Populists.
Land of smoke-filled cities and iron-mining frontiers. Into this gray world arrived a Scottish teenager named Andrew Carnegie. When he first set foot in America, he had only a few dollars in his pocket, but in his eyes burned a dream as hard as steel. Carnegie understood that America's future would be built from iron, railroads, bridges, and towering skyscrapers. But the greatest obstacle to that dream was British steel. At the time, Britain was the world's industrial godfather. British producers could ship high-quality steel to America at far lower prices than any domestic manufacturer. Carnegie knew that to compete with the British, sheer hard work would not be enough. What he needed was a massive government-built tariff wall. The Lobbyists' War and Washington's backroom deals. In the 1880s, a different kind of war was being fought in the dark rooms of Washington, D.C. Carnegie and like-minded industrialists entered into unwritten agreements with members of Congress. They successfully convinced politicians that if British iron keeps flooding in cheaply, American workers will starve. It was an economic strategy wrapped in the language of patriotism. The result was brutal tariffs on British steel. In 1867, a ton of British steel rails cost about $32. After tariffs, the same rails entered the American market at nearly $60 a ton. British competitors were effectively pushed out of the game. Carnegie's Steel Revolution. Behind this protective wall, Carnegie began building his empire. He did not merely reap profits, he reinvested them in new technology, most notably the Bessemer process, which revolutionized steelmaking in America. Now, he could produce massive quantities of steel in a very short time. With foreign competition neutralized, Carnegie could set prices largely as he wished. A significant portion of the profit from every ton of steel ultimately came from the pockets of ordinary Americans. When railroad companies bought steel at inflated prices, they passed the cost on to passengers through higher ticket fares. Carnegie became one of the richest men in the world, but his towering palace of wealth rested firmly on the pillars of tariffs. The Homestead Strike, when tariffs were no blessing. July 1992, a bloody conflict erupted at Carnegie's steel plant, an event remembered as the Homestead Strike. Carnegie publicly claimed that tariffs existed to protect workers' wages. Reality told a different story. Despite soaring profits, his general manager, Henry Clay Frick, announced wage cuts and attempted to crush the union. The company was protected by tariffs, but the workers were not. The confrontation turned violent, leaving multiple people dead. Ordinary Americans began to realize that tariffs were not merely protecting infant industries, they were creating colossal corporate powers capable of strangling workers without mercy. J.P. Morgan and a billion-dollar transfer. On a cold morning in 1901, Andrew Carnegie sent a small note to his longtime rival and banker, J.P. Morgan. Written on it was the price of his company, $480 million, equivalent to hundreds of billions of dollars today. Morgan accepted the note without negotiation and said, "Congratulations, Mr. Carnegie, you are now the richest man in the world." Carnegie retired, but he left behind an America whose economy resembled a fortress surrounded by tariffs. Within this fortress were born the first American billionaires. Carnegie's steel empire helped turn the United States into the world's leading industrial power, but the price was paid by ordinary people through higher costs of living and a long legacy of political corruption. By the early 1990s, the American dream was dying in the dirt of Kansas, Nebraska, and Dakota. While men like Andrew Carnegie and J.P. Morgan were building gilded palaces in New York, the American farmer was being crushed by a triple vice. The first was the railroad monopolies. The second was the gold standard. But the third, and perhaps most painful, was the protective tariff. The farmer's trap. The American farmer lived in a world of cruel irony. Because of the tariff, everything the farmer sold, wheat, corn, cotton, had to be sold on a competitive world market. If a farmer in Iowa wanted to sell his grain, he had to compete with the low prices of farmers in Russia and Argentina. However, everything that same farmer bought, plows, harvesters, barbed wire, clothes, and kerosene, was protected by the McKinley Tariff of 1990. Because foreign tools were taxed at 50%, American manufacturers could keep their prices artificially high. The farmer was essentially a captive customer. He was being forced to sell cheap and buy dear. By 1894, the price of a bushel of wheat had dropped to just 50 cents, less than it cost to grow it, while the price of a John Deere plow remained high. Families were losing their land to the banks, and the yeoman farmer, once the hero of the American story, became a debt slave. The rise of the populist storm. Out of this desperation, a new movement rose like a prairie fire. The People's Party, the Populists. They didn't care about the sophisticated economic theories of the East Coast. They saw the tariff as a theft. They argued that the government had turned the tax system into a giant vacuum cleaner that sucked wealth out of the rural South and West and deposited it into the bank accounts of the industrial North. Their leader was a young, charismatic lawyer from Nebraska with a voice like a silver trumpet. The 1896 Convention, a clash of civilizations. In July 1996, the Democratic National Convention met in Chicago. The party was split between the Gold Democrats of the East and the Silver Democrats and Populists of the West. Bryan walked onto the stage. He didn't just want to talk about money, he wanted to talk about the soul of America. He looked at the delegates and issued a challenge to the industrial titans and the tariff mongers. You come to us and tell us that the great cities are in favor of the gold standard. We reply that the great cities rest on our broad and fertile prairies. Burn down your cities and leave our farms, and your cities will spring up as if by magic. But destroy our farms, and the grass will grow in the streets of every city in the country. He ended his speech with the most famous lines in American political history, shouting that the working man should not be crucified upon a cross of gold. The battle of the billionaires versus the people. The 1996 election became a war. On one side was Bryan, traveling thousands of miles by train, speaking to millions of farmers about lowering the tariff and freeing the currency. On the other was William McKinley, the Napoleon of protection. The industrialists were terrified of Bryan. They believed that if he won and lowered the tariff, American industry would collapse. Mark Hanna, the Republican strategist, raised a record-breaking $3.5 million, equivalent to hundreds of millions of dollars today, from corporations to defeat Bryan. Factory owners even told their workers, if Bryan wins on Tuesday, do not come into work on Wednesday. The factory will be closed. The result, the wall stays up. McKinley won. The industrial North and the urban workers feared losing their jobs if the tariff wall fell, and they voted for the full dinner pail. The farmers' rebellion was crushed, and in 1997, McKinley signed the Dingley tariff, pushing rates to an all-time high of 52%. For a few more years, the billionaires were safe, and the American consumer continued to pay the highest prices in the world. But Bryan's rebellion had changed something forever. It proved that the tariff was no longer a boring tax issue. It was a class war. The fire Bryan started would eventually lead to the birth of the income tax, as the American people realized that you cannot fund a nation solely on the backs of the poor, while the rich hide behind a wall of protected trade.
A single bullet fired by an anarchist in Buffalo, New York, had just ended the life of President William McKinley, the high priest of protectionism. In his place stood a man the Republican establishment absolutely dreaded, Theodore Roosevelt. At 42, he was the youngest president in history, a man of manic energy, a war hero, and a hunter of big game. But as he stepped into the Oval Office, he realized he was facing a beast more dangerous than any grizzly bear in the Rockies, the industrial trusts. For decades, the high tariff had acted as a giant incubator for these trusts. Behind the 50% tax wall, monopolies in steel, sugar, tobacco, and oil had grown so large they were more powerful than the government itself. They dictated prices, crushed labor unions, and literally bought seats in the U.S. Senate.
The tariff was no longer protecting America. It was shielding a new class of economic kings. The Republican nightmare. The Republican Party was built on the Holy Trinity: the gold standard, the big business, and the high tariff. To touch the tariff was considered political suicide. Mark Hanna, the puppet master of the party, famously advised his colleagues to stand pat, meaning don't change a single comma of the tax code. But Roosevelt was a different breed. He saw the growing anger of the American people. He heard the echoes of William Jennings Bryan's farmers. He knew that if the Republican Party didn't bend, the country would eventually break under the pressure of a socialist revolution. TR began to speak of a square deal for every American. But to get to that square deal, he had to confront the wall of protection, the backroom betrayal. Roosevelt was a master of the big stick, but he was also a genius at the long game. He knew that if he attacked the tariff directly, the old guard in the Senate, led by the formidable Nelson Aldrich, would block every single one of his reforms. Aldrich was known as the general manager of the United States, and his loyalty to the high tariff was absolute. In a series of tense, private meetings at the White House, Roosevelt struck a dangerous bargain. He told the Senate leaders, "I will keep my hands off your tariff for now if you let me pass the laws to regulate the railroads and the food industry." It was a tactical retreat. While the tariff wall remained high, TR used the breathing room to launch over 40 antitrust lawsuits. He took on Northern Securities. He took on Standard Oil. He was proving that the government, not the billionaires, was the supreme power in America. But every time he took down a trust, he saw the same root cause. The high tariff was the mother of all trusts. The revolt of the progressives. By 1908, Roosevelt was stepping down, handing the torch to his hand-picked successor, William Howard Taft. Roosevelt's final instruction was clear: lower the tariff. The American public was screaming for it. The cost of living was soaring, and people were tired of paying monopoly prices for basic goods. However, Taft lacked Roosevelt's political instincts. In 1909, he called a special session of Congress to revise the tariff. What followed was one of the most disgraceful displays of corporate greed in Washington's history. Thousands of lobbyists descended on the Capitol. Representatives from the wool industry, the iron industry, and the chemical industry literally wrote the amendments themselves. By the time the Payne-Aldrich tariff reached Taft's desk, it didn't lower the rates. In many cases, it raised them. The speech that shattered a party. Taft, wanting to keep peace with the old guard, signed the bill. Then, in a moment of historic tone deafness, he traveled to Winona, Minnesota, the heart of the anti-tariff West, and declared that the Payne-Aldrich Act was the best tariff bill the Republican Party ever passed. The reaction was explosive. In the audience, farmers and small business owners felt betrayed. Deep in the African jungle where he was on safari, Theodore Roosevelt read the news and was furious. His protege had surrendered to the puppet masters. This betrayal set the stage for the most chaotic election in American history, 1912. Roosevelt returned to America, formed the Big Moose Party, and declared war on his own former friend. The Republican Party was split in half. The fortress of protection that had stood since the Civil War was finally cracking. Because the Republicans couldn't agree on how to fix the tariff, they opened the door for a skinny, intellectual professor from Princeton named Wilson. Wilson didn't want to adjust the tariff. He wanted to destroy the wall entirely and replace it with something the wealthy feared even more: the income tax. The air in Washington, D.C. on April 8, 1913 was electric, thick with the scent of a coming storm. For the first time since the presidency of John Adams in 1801, more than 100 years prior, a president of the United States was preparing to do something considered radical, almost kingly. Woodrow Wilson, the former Princeton professor with a rigid jaw and a schoolmaster's intensity, was not going to send a polite written message to the Capitol. Instead, he was going to march directly into the halls of Congress to look the tariff lobby in the eye. Wilson viewed the high protective tariff not as a policy, but as a system of spoils. He believed that for 50 years, the Republican Party had built a fortress around America that didn't just keep out foreign goods, it kept in the corruption, the monopolies, and the invisible government of Wall Street. To Wilson, the high tariff was a chain on the neck of the American consumer, and he had come to break it. The siege of the lobbyists. As Wilson stood before the joint session of Congress, he spoke with a cold, intellectual fury. He declared that the federal government had been put at the service of private interests. He demanded a competitive tariff, one that would force the giant American trusts to actually compete with the rest of the world. But as soon as Wilson left the podium, the beast fought back. Within 24 hours, Washington was flooded. The hotels were packed with thousands of lobbyists, men representing the wool kings of Ohio, the sugar barons of Louisiana, and the steel titans of Pennsylvania. They used every trick in the book. They threatened to close factories, they offered campaign contributions, and they planted fake stories in newspapers claiming that a lower tariff would bring an immediate national famine. But Wilson was a master of the bully pulpit. He did something no president had ever done. He issued a public statement to the American people, calling out the lobbyists by name. He exposed their insidious presence in the Capitol corridors. He turned the spotlight so bright that the senators, who usually took bribes in the shadows, were forced to scurry like rats. The unfair trade-off, the birth of the 16th Amendment. The biggest obstacle Wilson faced was a simple, terrifying question of math, the revenue hole. For over a century, the tariff had been the government's primary source of oxygen. It paid for the Navy, the post offices, and the pensions. If Wilson cut the tariff by half, the government would go bankrupt within months. To solve this, Wilson and his allies, men like Congressman Cole Hull, unleashed the ultimate weapon, the federal income tax. Earlier that year, the 16th Amendment had been ratified, giving Congress the power to tax people's earnings directly. To the wealthy elite, this was the end of the world. They argued it was socialism, a confiscation of property, and a violation of the American spirit. But to the farmers of the West and the workers of the North, it was justice. Why should a poor man pay a 50% tariff tax on his wool coat while a millionaire paid nothing on his profits? The midnight vote. The battle in the Senate lasted for months. It was a war of attrition. Wilson stayed in the White House, personally calling senators at 2 a.m. to keep them in line. The leader of the opposition, the aging lion, Nelson Aldrich, fought until he was blue in the face, warning that lowering the tariff would Europeanize America and destroy the middle class. Finally, in the late summer of 1913, the Underwood-Simmons Act was passed. It was a slaughter of the old guard. The cut. Average tariff rates were slashed from 40% to 26%. The free list. For the first time in generations, basic necessities like wool, sugar, iron ore, and steel rails were put on the free list, zero tax. The income tax. To fill the revenue hole, a modest tax of 1% was placed on incomes over $3,000, with a surtax of up to 7% for the ultra-wealthy. The irony of fate. Wilson had won. He had successfully demolished the wall of protection that had stood since the Civil War. He stood in his office signing the bill with a triumphant smile, believing he had ushered in a new era of global free trade and peace. But history has a cruel sense of timing. Less than 1 year later, in the summer of 1914, a Serbian assassin's bullet in Sarajevo would spark World War I. Suddenly, the free trade Wilson had fought for became impossible. European factories were bombed into rubble. German U-boats began sinking merchant ships. The silence that followed the armistice of 1918 was not the silence of peace, but the silence of exhaustion. America emerged from World War I as the world's greatest creditor, a shimmering industrial titan that had fed and armed the broken nations of Europe. But as the smoke cleared from the battlefields of France, a cold, shivering wind of isolationism began to blow through the streets of Washington, D.C. The American people were tired. They were tired of Wilsonian idealism, tired of European squabbles, and terrified of the Red Scare rising from the new Soviet Union. The cry of the day was return to normalcy, and in the 1920s, normalcy meant one thing: building the walls back up. The Republican Restoration. In 1920, the Republican Party swept back into power under Warren G. Harding. The era of Woodrow Wilson's low tariffs was viewed as a dangerous experiment that had left American farmers vulnerable to a post-war collapse in prices. As European farmers returned to their fields, a global surplus of grain hit the market. Prices plummeted. The American Midwest, which had been the breadbasket of democracy, was suddenly drowning in debt. The politicians in Washington reached for the only tool they trusted, the emergency tariff of 1921, followed quickly by the Fordney-McCumber tariff of 1922. This was not just an adjustment, it was a counter-revolution. The rates on farm products were doubled, but the industrialists, ever opportunistic, saw their chance. They latched onto the bill like leeches. By the time it was signed, duties on chemicals, silks, and toys reached heights never seen before. The wall of protection was not just rebuilt, it was reinforced with steel and concrete. The scientific illusion. The 1922 Act introduced a cunning new concept, the flexible tariff. It gave the president the power to raise or lower duties by 50% based on the cost of production. On paper, it sounded like a scientific way to ensure fair competition. In reality, it was a weapon. If a Japanese toy manufacturer found a way to make a doll cheaper than a factory in Ohio, the Ohio factory owner would simply run to the Tariff Commission, complain about unfair labor, and the president would jack up the tax. For a few years, it looked like a miracle. The roaring 20s were in full swing. The stock market was climbing to the moon, jazz filled the air, and Henry Ford's Model Ts were rolling off the line by the millions. Because the rest of the world was still rebuilding, America didn't feel the consequences of its isolation. We were selling to everyone, but making it nearly impossible for anyone to sell to us. The gathering clouds. By 1928, the cracks began to show. America's trading partners, Britain, France, Canada, were furious. They owed billions of dollars in war debts to the U.S. Treasury. They pleaded with Washington, "We want to pay you back, but we can only get the dollars if we sell you our goods. If you tax our goods out of your market, we cannot pay you." The U.S. ignored them. Instead, a new president, Herbert Hoover, entered the White House. Hoover was a brilliant engineer, a man of logic, but he was trapped by a campaign promise he had made to struggling farmers. He called a special session of Congress to slightly adjust the tariff on agricultural goods. He had no idea he was about to unleash a monster. The madness of Smoot and Hawley. What happened next is recorded in the annals of economic history as a collective insanity. Two men, Senator Reed Smoot, a grim, high-collared Mormon from Utah, and Representative Willis Hawley of Oregon took charge of the bill. As soon as the doors opened, the lobbyist siege of 1913 looked like a tea party in comparison. Over 1,000 industries sent representatives to demand protection. The bill became a log-rolling nightmare. "I'll vote for a tax on your Vermont maple syrup if you vote for a tax on my Florida citrus." They began taxing things that didn't even exist in America. They taxed everything from flax to chemicals to Swiss watches. In June 1930, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act reached its final form. It was a 1,000-page suicide note for the global economy. over 1,028 prominent economists signed a desperate petition begging Hoover to veto the bill. They warned that it would raise the cost of living, destroy our exports, and spark a global trade war. Even the titans of industry were split. Thomas Lamont, a partner at J.P. Morgan, famously said he almost went down on his knees to beg Hoover not to sign it. Henry Ford called it an economic blunder. The signing of the death warrant. But Hoover, ever the party man, felt he couldn't betray the Republican platform. On June 17, 1930, with a gold pen, he signed the bill into law. The retaliation was instantaneous. It wasn't a ripple, it was a tidal wave. Canada, the U.S.'s largest customer, was outraged. They immediately raised their own tariffs on 125 American products. France slapped an 85% tax on American cars. Spain retaliated against American oranges. Switzerland launched a total boycott of American products. The timing could not have been worse. The stock market had already crashed in 1929, and the world was teetering on the edge. Smoot-Hawley provided the final shove into the abyss. By 1932, American exports had plummeted by 61%. Farmers who thought the tariff would save them watched their crops rot in the fields because no one in Europe could afford to buy them. The Great Wall had turned into a great cage. America had successfully shut the world out, but in doing so, it had locked itself in a basement with a dying economy. The Great Depression was no longer an American downturn. It was a global catastrophe, and the stage was being set for a new kind of leader to emerge from the ruins. Men who promised to fix the economy through iron, blood, and total war. By the winter of 1932, the United States was a ghost of its former self. The Great Wall of Smoot-Hawley had not brought prosperity. It had brought a silence so profound it was terrifying. Across the Midwest, farmers stood with shotguns to stop banks from foreclosing on homes that had been in their families for generations. In the cities, men who had once been proud foremen in steel mills stood in bread lines, their coats thin against the freezing wind. Global trade had not just slowed, it had practically ceased to exist. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt was inaugurated in March 1933, the nation was looking for action and action now. But while FDR focused on the alphabet soup of the New Deal, the CCC, the WPA, the TVA, there was one man in his cabinet who was looking past the American borders. He was a tall, silver-haired man from the hills of Tennessee, a man with the soul of a philosopher and the tenacity of a mountain lion. Cordell Hull, the new Secretary of State. The man with a mission. Cordell Hull was a tariff man in reverse. For 30 years, first in the House of Representatives and then in the Senate, he had studied the ledgers of history. He had come to a conclusion that was radical for his time. High tariffs were the seeds of war. Hull believed that when a nation shuts its doors to its neighbors, it breeds resentment, poverty, and eventually aggression. He looked across the Atlantic and saw a desperate Germany and a militaristic Japan, and he realized that their descent into fascism was fueled by the economic strangulation caused by trade barriers. To Hull, the great American tariff was not just a tax, it was a weapon of mass destruction that had backfired on the world. The battle within the cabinet. Even within FDR's own brain trust, Hull was an outsider. Most of Roosevelt's advisors were nationalists. They wanted to fix America first by cutting off the rest of the world entirely, devaluing the dollar, and raising prices through government control. They thought Hull's obsession with free trade was an old-fashioned Victorian fantasy. During the London Economic Conference of 1933, Hull sat in a hotel room humiliated as Roosevelt sent a bombshell message that effectively killed any hope of international trade cooperation. Hull almost resigned, but he didn't. He waited. He knew that the nationalist path would eventually fail, and when it did, he would be ready with his blueprints for a new world.
the Revolutionary Act of 1934. By 1934, even the hardline isolationists in Congress were starting to realize that Smoot-Hawley was a disaster. American exports had vanished. Hoole saw his opening. He didn't ask Congress to repeal the tariff. That would have started a political war he couldn't win. Instead, he asked for something much more clever, the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act. This law was a masterpiece of political maneuvering. It gave the president the power to negotiate for tit-for-tat deals with other countries. If Brazil lowered its tax on American steel, the president could lower the American tax on Brazilian coffee by up to 50% without needing to go back to Congress for a vote. This was a constitutional revolution. For 145 years, Congress had guarded its power to set tariffs like a dragon guarding gold. The world found itself divided not just by iron curtains, but by the flow of technology and goods. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, the Pax Americana trade system that Cordell Hull had envisioned was facing its first true existential threat. The United States, which had spent billions rebuilding Japan and West Germany through the Marshall Plan and post-war aid, suddenly looked in the mirror and realized its babies had grown into giants. This chapter is the story of how the American tariff evolved from a simple tax on cloth and iron into a high-stakes weapon of the technological Cold War. The Japan Inc. Panic. By the mid-1970s, the American Midwest, the same region that had once been the industrial heart of the world, began to feel a chill. It started with radios and televisions, then moved to steel, and finally to the crown jewel of American industry, the automobile. Japanese companies like Toyota, Honda, and Sony were no longer making cheap copies. They were making products that were better, more fuel efficient, and more reliable than anything coming out of Detroit or Pittsburgh. For the first time since the 1800s, Americans felt an economic fear that wasn't about a depression, but about being surpassed. In Washington, the cry for protection returned, but this time it was different. Under the GATT rules, the Global Trade Agreement, the U.S. couldn't just jack up tariffs to 50% like they did in the 1920s without sparking a global war. Instead, they invented a new shadow tariff known as Voluntary Export Restraints, VERs. The shadow tariffs of the 80s. The Reagan administration in the 1980s faced a massive dilemma. Ronald Reagan was a public champion of free trade, but his voters in the Rust Belt were losing their jobs. The solution was a masterclass in political theater. The U.S. persuaded Japan to voluntarily limit the number of cars they sent to America. While technically not a tariff in name, it had the exact same effect. Because the supply of Japanese cars was limited, their prices went up. This gave Ford and GM room to breathe, but it cost the American consumer billions. It was the 19th century tariff war, just dressed in a suit and tie and hidden behind diplomatic agreements. The birth of the semiconductor war. The real battle, however, wasn't over steel or cars. It was over the future. By 1986, Japan controlled the world market for DRAM memory chips. The U.S. government realized that if it lost the ability to make its own chips, it would lose its military edge. In a shocking move that mirrored the Black Tariff of 1842, the U.S. slapped a 100% tariff on a specific list of Japanese electronics. This wasn't about revenue, it was about industrial sovereignty. The U.S. was using the tariff to force Japan to stop dumping cheap chips and to open its own markets to American tech. This was the birth of managed trade, the idea that the government should sit at the table and decide exactly how much of a product is sold, where it's made, and what the price should be. The invisible hand of the market was being guided by the very visible hand of the U.S. trade representative. The Great Shift.
from the west to the east. As the 1990s arrived, the Cold War ended. The Soviet Union collapsed, and for a brief moment, it looked as if the end of history had arrived. The U.S. pushed for the creation of the WTO and signed NAFTA. The goal was to erase borders entirely. The tariff wall was brought down to its lowest level in human history, less than 3% on average. Multinational corporations began moving their factories to wherever labor was cheapest. But as the factories left Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, they didn't all go to Mexico. They went to a rising dragon, China. For 20 years, the U.S. ignored the warnings. They believed that by bringing China into the world trade system with low tariffs, China would eventually become a democracy. It was the Hull doctrine on steroids. But China didn't play by the old rules. They used state capitalism, subsidizing their own industries and forcing American companies to hand over their technology in exchange for market access. The silent fuse. By the time 2016 arrived, the Silicon Wall had been breached. The American people felt that the low tariff era had been a great betrayal. The wealth of the nation was growing, but it was all staying in Silicon Valley and Wall Street, while the main streets of the country were falling apart. The fuse was lit. The world was about to see a return to the big stick policy of the 1800s. The 21st century was not going to be an era of borderless peace, but a return to the most primal economic struggle in American history, the fight for the protective wall. Chapter 20, The Dragon and the Wall, 2025 and the New Economic Sovereignty. If Alexander Hamilton were to wake up in the year 2025, he would recognize the headlines immediately. After nearly a century of trying to open the world, the United States has officially returned to its roots as a protectionist power. This is the final chapter of our saga, a story of decoupling, reshoring, and the most aggressive use of tariffs in modern history. The America First earthquake. The shift began in 2018 when the U.S. used an obscure Cold War-era law, Section 232, to declare that imported steel was a threat to national security. This wasn't just about protecting a few mills. It was a psychological break from the WTO. The U.S. was saying, our domestic industry is more important than international law. Then came the big one, a massive, sweeping tariff on over $360 billion worth of Chinese goods. For the first time since the 1930s, the U.S. was using the tariff as a leverage tool to force a superpower to change its entire economic system. The 2025 reality, Fortress America. As we stand today, in the late months of 2025, the tariff war has become a tariff reality. The government has moved beyond just taxing imports. We are now in the era of strategic protectionism. 1. The Green Wall. In a move to win the climate war, the U.S. has placed 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs. The argument, if we allow cheap, subsidized Chinese cars to flood our market, we will never build our own green energy industry. It is the infant industry argument of 1789, updated for the 21st century. 2. The Chips and Science Act. While not a tariff, this is the other side of protectionism. The U.S. is spending $52 billion in direct subsidies to bring chip manufacturing back to Arizona and Ohio. To protect that investment, the U.S. has placed export controls, a reverse tariff that forbids the sale of advanced AI chips to rivals. 3. The end of the de minimis loophole. For years, millions of packages from sites like Shein and Temu entered the U.S. tax-free because they were under $800. In 2025, that back door was slammed shut. Every package, no matter how small, is now subject to the modern tariff.
the Great Recalculation. The results of this 2025 Great Adjustment are a mirror of the 1800s. The victory, manufacturing construction in the U.S. has reached an all-time high. For the first time in 40 years, Made in USA is a growing reality in the tech sector. The cost, inflation, has become the new normal. When you tax the world, the price of the world goes up. The American consumer is once again paying the protection tax that Andrew Carnegie's customers paid 150 years ago. The final word, the eternal ledger. We have traveled through 239 years of American history. We have seen the tariff used to build a nation, to fund a war, to protect a monopoly, to spark a depression, and now to reclaim a future. The early American tariff adjustments were never just about money. They were about the definition of America. Are we a country that buys from the world or a country that builds for itself? Are we a global empire or a self-sufficient republic? As the ledgers of 2025 are written, the answer seems to be that we are returning to the vision of Hamilton. The wall is back, the trusts are being challenged, and the farmer and worker are once again at the center of the political storm. History is not a straight line towards free trade. It is a pendulum that swings between the open door and the strong wall.
World War II until the mid-2010s, the world operated under a singular shimmering illusion, the idea that borders were obsolete. The global village promised that a chip designed in California, etched in Taiwan, and assembled in China was the peak of human efficiency. We believed that trade had finally conquered geography. But as the clock struck midnight on the year 2024 and the world turned toward 2025, that illusion didn't just crack, it shattered into a million pieces of jagged glass. America has returned to the Hamiltonian fortress. This is not just a policy change, it is a total cultural and economic reclamation. The death of the efficiency god. For decades, American CEOs were taught one commandment: efficiency is king. They chased the lowest labor costs across the globe, leaving behind empty factories in Ohio and rusted-out towns in Michigan. But in 2025, a new commandment has replaced it. Resilience is sovereign. The U.S. government, now operating under a bipartisan consensus that would have shocked the politicians of the 1990s, has declared that being efficient is worthless if you are vulnerable. If a rival nation can flip a switch and cut off your medicine, your car parts, or your military sensors, then you are not a superpower. You are a hostage. To solve this, the United States has deployed the most sophisticated tariff architecture in human history. It is no longer just a flat tax at the border. It is a digital moat. The 2025 ironclad tariffs. As we look at the ledgers of 2025, we see three distinct firewalls that have been built to protect the American future. The 100% barrier on future tech. The U.S. has officially blocked the subsidized invasion of Chinese green technology. By placing a 100% tariff on electric vehicles and a 50% tariff on solar cells, the government has essentially told the world, we will build our own batteries, we will mine our own lithium, and we will manufacture our own energy future, even if it costs us more in the short term. The Reciprocate Act. Taking a page from the 1890s, the U.S. has passed the United States Reciprocal Trade Act. It is a simple, brutal law. If a foreign country charges a 25% tax on American whiskey or pork, the U.S. president must automatically charge that same 25% on their exports. It is the end of turning the other cheek in trade. The Human Rights Surcharge. In a move that blends morality with economics, the U.S. now applies a variable tariff based on labor standards. If a factory in Southeast Asia uses forced labor or ignores environmental laws to keep prices low, the U.S. applies a social dump tax. This levels the playing field for the American worker, who has to follow strict safety and environmental rules. The Renaissance in the Rust Belt. Walk through the streets of Columbus, Ohio, or Spartanburg, South Carolina in late 2025, and you will see something that hasn't been seen in 50 years: the crane renaissance. Because of the tariff wall, the massive Silicon heartland is no longer a dream. It is a forest of steel and concrete. Intel, TSMC, and Samsung are building megafabs on American soil, because the tax on foreign chips has made it too expensive to stay overseas. These aren't the dark, soot-covered factories of Andrew Carnegie's era. These are lights-out facilities run by AI and high-tech robotics, where the American worker is now a highly paid technician monitoring a fleet of machines. The high cost of sovereignty. But every story of growth has a shadow. Just as the farmers of 1828 screamed about the tariff of abominations, the American consumer of 2025 is feeling the protectionist squeeze. An iPhone that once cost $999 now costs $1,200 because the components are no longer tax-free imports. Coffee and chocolate, once cheap staples, have become luxury items as trade wars with South American and African blocs heat up. The world is no longer flat, it is bumpy. Travel is more expensive, logistics are more complex, and the global just-in-time delivery system has been replaced by just-in-case stockpiling. Conclusion: the eternal return. We have come full circle. In 1789, Alexander Hamilton wrote the first tariff to ensure that a young, weak America wouldn't be bullied by the British Empire. In 2025, the United States is using the same tool to ensure it isn't eclipsed by the rising powers of the East. The early American tariff adjustments were the birth pangs of a giant. The 2025 adjustments are the defensive maneuvers of a titan that has realized that globalism was a detour, not a destination. The ledger is never closed. As long as there are borders, there will be taxes. As long as there are nations, there will be walls. The history of the American tariff is the history of the American struggle to define its own independence. In 2025, the wall is high, the factories are humming, and the world is watching to see if this new fortress will lead to a golden age of innovation or a dark age of isolation. The simple tax has become the final weapon. 1890 felt like the end of the world for the average American family, but for the lords of industry, it was the dawn of a golden empire. Imagine a New York City boardroom. The air is thick with the smell of expensive Cuban cigars and the rustle of silk waistcoats. Around a massive mahogany table sit men like J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie, and the Sugar King, Henry Havermeyer. These men didn't just run companies, they ran the country, and their most powerful weapon, their shield against the world, was the protective tariff. But outside those boardrooms, a storm was brewing. This is the story of the McKinley Tariff of 1890, an act of such extreme economic aggression that it nearly tore the nation in two before the first shot of any war was ever fired. The architect, William McKinley, and the Napoleon Complex. In the halls of Congress, a man named William McKinley was earning his nickname, the Napoleon of Protection. McKinley wasn't just a politician, he was a true believer. He looked at a map of the world and saw it as a battlefield where foreign pauper labor was trying to steal the bread from the American mouths. In the spring of 1890, McKinley introduced a bill that would push American tariffs to an average of 49.5%. This wasn't a tax, it was a blockade. It targeted everything: wool, tin plate, clothing, and even the sugar that went into every child's tea. McKinley's argument was seductive. He told the factory workers of the North, if we tax the foreigner,
He pays for our government, and your wages stay high. It was a brilliant lie. In reality, the foreigner didn't pay the tax. The American housewife paid it every time she bought a tin cup or a woolen blanket. The Siege of the Tin Plate Kings. One of the most dramatic stories of the 1890 tariff was the Tin Plate War. At the time, the U.S. didn't even have a tin plate industry. We imported it all from Wales. McKinley decided to force an industry into existence. He slapped a massive tax on Welsh tin, hoping to force American capitalists to build their own factories. In the Welsh valleys, thousands of workers were suddenly plunged into poverty as their American market vanished. But in America, the price of canned food, the primary diet of the poor, skyrocketed. The Tin Plate Trust was born overnight, making a handful of men millionaires, while the price of a can of beans doubled. The tariff wasn't protecting an industry, it was creating a monopoly by government decree. The Housewife's Revolt and the 1890 lynchings. What the robber barons didn't count on was the fury of the American consumer. In the weeks leading up to the 1890 midterm elections, a strange phenomenon occurred. Traveling salesmen, many of them secretly hired by the opposition, went door to door in rural America. They would show a housewife a tin pail and say, "Last week this cost 25 cents. Because of McKinley, it now costs 50 cents. The anger was electric. For the first time, the economic war hit the kitchen table. In the 1890 elections, the Republican Party suffered one of the most catastrophic defeats in history. They were lynched at the ballot box. Even McKinley himself lost his seat in Congress. The people had spoken. They were tired of paying for the Gilded Age with their own hunger. The Panic of 1893. The wall crumbles. When the Democrats, led by Grover Cleveland, took power in 1892, they promised to smash the tariff. But they walked into a trap. Just as they began to lower the taxes, the Panic of 1893 hit. It was the worst economic collapse in U.S. history up to that point. Banks failed, railroads went bankrupt, and the unemployment rate hit 20%. The high tariff men laughed from the sidelines. They told the public, "See, as soon..."
Future 2027. The trade war that began in 2018 has reached its final, inevitable conclusion. The world of 2027 is no longer a global marketplace. It is a world of economic citadels. The Iron Cloud Protocol. In late 2026, a massive cyber attack on the American power grid was traced back to backdoor vulnerabilities in foreign-made hardware. The response from Washington was the Digital Sovereignty Act of 2027. This is the black tariff of the 21st century. Under this law, the U.S. has implemented a 300% tariff on any telecommunications or infrastructure equipment that is not manufactured within the Trust Zone, USA, Canada, UK, Australia, and Japan. This isn't about protecting profits, it is about protecting the national nervous system. The rise of the micro-mill. Because of the 2027 tariffs, the giant mega-factories of Asia are being replaced by American micro-mills. In towns across the Midwest, small, highly automated factories have popped up. Using 3D printing and AI-driven robotics, these mills can produce everything from car parts to medical devices right in the communities where they're needed. The tariff wall has made it cheaper to build a high-tech robotic factory in Indiana than to ship a container across the Pacific. The American worker of 2027 is no longer a man on an assembly line. He is an AI overseer, managing a fleet of machines that work 24/7. The climate border adjustment. The final piece of the 2027 puzzle is the carbon tariff. The U.S. now charges a clean air tax on any product coming from a country that doesn't follow strict environmental standards. If a factory in a foreign land burns coal to make steel, That steel is taxed at 150% when it reaches Los Angeles. If an American factory uses wind or solar power, it gets a green credit. This has turned the tariff into a tool for saving the planet. For the first time, social and environmental cost is added to the financial cost. The final summary, the eternal ledger. As we conclude this epic saga, we see that the story of the American tariff is the story of the American will. In 1789, we fought for survival. In 1842, we fought for solvency. In 1890, we fought for empire. In 1930, we fought with fear. In 2027, we are fighting for sovereignty. The ledger is a circle. We have returned to the wisdom of the founders, that a nation that cannot feed itself, clothe itself, and defend itself with its own hands is not truly free. The wall is back. The smoke is rising once again from American chimneys, and the world has learned that the American market is not a right, but a privilege. The great adjustment is over. The new America has been built. The year was 1828. The American capital, Washington, D.C., was a swampy, unfinished city, but it was currently the site of the most complex economic chess match in history. The air was thick with the scent of conspiracy. This is the story of how a group of politicians tried to play a trick on the American public and ended up accidentally lighting a fuse that would lead directly to the Civil War. The conspiracy of the Jacksonians. The 1828 election was approaching. On one side was the incumbent, the intellectual John Quincy Adams, a man who loved high tariffs to build roads and canals. On the other side was Andrew Jackson, the hero of New Orleans, a man of the people. Jackson's supporters had a problem. They needed to win the votes of the northern factory owners, but they didn't want to alienate the southern farmers who hated taxes. So they devised a plan so clever it was dangerous. They decided to create a tariff bill so outrageous, so extreme, and so unfair that even the northerners would vote against it. Their goal was to make the bill fail. That way they could go to the north and say, "We tried to give you a tariff, but the others killed it," and go to the south and say, "We kept your taxes low." They called it the spider's web. The bill that refused to die. The Jacksonians loaded the bill with poison pills. They placed massive taxes on raw materials that northern manufacturers needed, things like raw wool, hemp for ships, and iron. They thought the northerners would be so angry about the cost of raw materials that they would reject the whole thing. But the plan backfired spectacularly. The northerners looked at the bill and thought, even with these high costs, a bad tariff is better than no tariff at all. To the horror of the conspirators, the bill passed. On May 19, 28, it became law. The tax on imported goods hit a staggering 45%, nearly half the value of every item coming into the country. The abomination and the Southern scream. When the news reached the South, the reaction wasn't just anger, it was a roar of betrayal. In South Carolina, flags flew at half-mast. They called it the abomination of tariffs. The Southerners realized they were being treated like a colony by their own government. They produced the cotton that made the country rich, but they had to buy their clothes, their tools, and their salt from the North at prices inflated by the tax. They were selling in a free market, but buying in a monopoly. This led to the nullification crisis. John C. Calhoun, the Vice President of the United States, secretly wrote a document arguing that a state had the right to nullify or ignore a federal law it found unconstitutional. He was essentially telling the North, if you don't stop taxing us, we will leave the Union. The tariff was no longer just a ledger of money, it had become a ledger of blood. The spider's web had caught the entire country, and the only way out would eventually be through the battlefield. We now accelerate into the near future, the summer of 2028. The world has fundamentally changed. The trade wars of the early 2020s were just the opening act. This is the story of the great reshoring, the moment America decided to become a maker again, no matter the cost. The zero-trust economy. By 2028, globalism has been replaced by regionalism. The Sovereign Core Act of 2028 has just been signed into law. It is the modern version of the 1828 tariff, but instead of wool and hemp, it focuses on the three pillars of power: energy, information, and medicine. Under this law, if a company wants to sell an AI-powered device in the U.S., 90% of the intellectual and physical property must be created within the United States or its closest allies. The tariff, a 200% tax on any semiconductor chip manufactured in a non-trusted zone. The result is the Great Migration of 2028. Thousands of companies that left America in the 1990s are now flooding back. They aren't coming back for cheap labor, they're coming back because the tariff wall has made it impossible to stay away. The digital Rust Belt becomes the Silicon Garden. In the old Rust Belt cities like Detroit, Gary, and Youngstown, the landscape has transformed. The 2027 tariffs have funded a national automation grant. The government isn't just taxing imports, it's using that money to build dark factories, fully automated plants that run on clean American nuclear and fusion energy. The American worker of 2028 is a prompt engineer or a robotic surgeon. The tariff has created a high-price environment, but it has also created a high-wage environment. The full dinner pail of the 1890s has been replaced by the digital equity stake of the 2020s. The Great Global Realignment. The rest of the world has followed suit. The 2028 trade divorce is complete. The North American bloc, self-sufficient, high-tech, and heavily protected. The Eurasian bloc, resource-rich but struggling to access Western consumer markets. The universal consumer, who could buy anything from anywhere with a click of a button, is gone. In 2028, when you buy a product, you are making a political statement. You are supporting your sovereign core. The final summary, the eternal ledger. As we conclude this epic saga, we see that the eternal truth of the American story. The tariff is the pendulum of power. When the pendulum swings toward free trade, we get cheap goods but lost jobs and weak borders. When the pendulum swings toward protection, we get high prices but national strength and economic independence. In 1828, the pendulum swung too far and nearly broke the clock. In 2028, the pendulum has swung back with a vengeance. We have learned that cheap is not the same as good, and efficiency is not the same as security. The American tariff is the great wall of the Republic, a wall built of laws, taxes, and the iron will of a people who decided that they would rather be masters of their own house than servants of a global market. The Great Adjustment is over. The new America has been built.
We now accelerate into the near future, the summer of 2028. The world has fundamentally changed. The trade wars of the early 2020s were just the opening act. This is the story of the great reshoring, the moment America decided to become a maker again, no matter the cost. The zero-trust economy. By 2028, globalism has been replaced by regionalism. The Sovereign Core Act of 2028 has just been signed into law. It is the modern version of the 1828 tariff, but instead of wool and hemp, it focuses on the three pillars of power: energy, information, and medicine. Under this law, if a company wants to sell an AI-powered device in the U.S., 90% of the intellectual and physical property must be created within the United States or its closest allies. The tariff,
a 200% tax on any semiconductor chip manufactured in a non-trusted zone. The result, the Great Migration of 2028. Thousands of companies that left America in the 1990s are now flooding back. They aren't coming back for cheap labor. They are coming back because the tariff wall has made it impossible to stay away. The digital Rust Belt becomes the Silicon Garden. In the old Rust Belt cities like Detroit, Gary, and Youngstown, the landscape has transformed. The 2028 tariffs have funded a national automation grant. The government isn't just taxing imports, it's using that money to build dark factories, fully automated plants that run on clean American nuclear and fusion energy. The American worker of 2028 is a prompt engineer or a robotic surgeon. The tariff has created a high-price environment, but it has also created a high-wage environment. The full dinner pail of the 1890s has been replaced by the digital equity stake of the 2020s. The Great Global Realignment. The rest of the world has followed suit. The 2028 trade divorce is complete. The North American bloc, self-sufficient, high-tech, and heavily protected. The Eurasian bloc, resource-rich but struggling to access Western consumer markets. The universal consumer who could buy anything from anywhere with a click of a button is gone. In 2028, when you buy a product, you are making a political statement. You are supporting your sovereign core. The final summary, the pendulum of power. As our saga reaches its ultimate peak, we see the eternal truth of the American story. The tariff is the pendulum of power. When the pendulum swings toward free trade, we get cheap goods but lost jobs and weak borders. When the pendulum swings toward protection, we get high prices but national strength and economic independence. In 1828, the pendulum swung too far and nearly broke the clock. In 2028, the pendulum has swung back with a vengeance. We have learned that cheap is not the same as good, and efficiency is not the same as security. The American tariff is the Great Wall of the Republic, a wall built of laws, taxes, and the iron will of a people who decided that they would rather be masters of their own house than servants of a